It's September 6th, 1976. A young Soviet Air Force lieutenant walked his 4-year-old son to kindergarten, kissed him goodbye, and drove to his airbase in the Russian Far East. He went through his pre-flight medical checks, and at 12:50 in the afternoon, he climbed into the cockpit of the most feared fighter jet in the world, took off with his squadron, and never came back. What he did that morning didn't just end his life in the Soviet Union. It handed the West the single greatest intelligence prize of the entire Cold War, and it shattered one of the most carefully constructed myths the Soviet military had ever built. To understand why Belenko did what he did, you have to understand what the Soviet Union looked like from the inside in the 1970s. Not from the propaganda posters, not from the speeches, but from the ground level of a remote military base deep in the Russian Far East. Viktor Belenko was born and raised in the Soviet city of Nalchik. As a young man, he chose to pursue an aviation career, graduating from the prestigious Soviet Air Force Academy. He rose through the ranks steadily. In 1976, Belenko was a lieutenant with the 513th Fighter Regiment, 11th Air Army, Soviet Air Defense Forces, a branch separate from the regular Soviet Air Force and arguably more prestigious. He was stationed at Chuguyevka, deep in Russia's Far East, and this is where the myth collided with reality. Chuguyevka Air Base was in severe need of repairs. Troop morale was particularly low. When Belenko made suggestions on how to improve conditions, he was ignored by superiors. The elite pilots of the Soviet air defense, men trusted with the nation's most advanced hardware, were living in conditions that told a very different story from the one on the posters. And then there was his marriage. His wife, Lyudmila, hailing from a wealthy family and not suited to life as a military wife, had told him she intended to file for divorce and move with their son Dmitry back to her parents' home in Magadan. A crumbling base, a crumbling marriage, a system that punished men for asking the wrong questions. Belenko had given everything the Soviet Union asked of him: his youth, his talent, his obedience. And in return, it had given him this: a leaking barracks in the middle of nowhere and a political officer who laughed at his suggestions. He started asking questions that were dangerous to ask, about the gap between what the Soviet Union promised and what it delivered, about whether any of the ideology was real, or whether it had always been a performance for men like him to maintain, while those at the top lived differently. The answers he arrived at were not acceptable answers to have inside the Soviet Union. Now, this is the machine at the center of this story, the Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-25. By 1976, the MiG-25 had achieved something that very few weapons in history ever achieve. It had become more powerful as a myth than it ever was as a machine. The U.S. Secretary of the Air Force, Robert Seamans, publicly declared the MiG-25 was probably the best interceptor in production in the world today. The United States had devoted enormous resources to answering a single strategic question: how do we counter this aircraft? The F-15 Eagle, one of the most successful fighter jets ever built, was partly designed specifically to counter the MiG-25. An entire generation of American air superiority doctrine had been shaped around a plane that no Western analyst had ever examined up close. That is the scale of the Foxbat's reputation. And Belenko flew one. every mission. He knew exactly what the West believed about it. He also knew something else, something known only to a small number of men inside the Soviet military. The myth and the machine were not the same thing.
The 29-year-old Belenko correctly assumed the United States would want a Foxbat. He planned to deliver one, in person, in exchange for asylum. Belenko set his escape date for September 6, 1976, when weather forecasts gave him the best chance. He selected Chitose Air Base in southern Hokkaido as his destination, a military airfield with a runway long enough to handle the Foxbat. On the morning of September 6th, Belenko walked his son to kindergarten. Then he drove to the base. The mission that morning had deliberate cover built into it. The squadron would fire rockets. A group of MiG-23s from other bases would also be airborne. There would be noise, activity, a reason for multiple aircraft to be moving in multiple directions. Takeoff was at 12:50. Shortly after becoming airborne, Belenko reported engine problems and separated from the group. 40 minutes after this separation, the Japanese coast appears through his canopy. He intended to land at Chitose Air Base, but couldn't, due to he was almost out of fuel. He settled for a civilian airport in the city of Hakodate. Putting the MiG-25 down on a commercial airliner's runway, he nearly overruns it and stops with the tanks dry. Seeing Japanese ground crews gathering from every direction, Belenko climbs down from the cockpit, draws his pistol and fires a warning shot into the air to hold them back. The most secret aircraft in the Soviet arsenal is sitting on a civilian runway in Japan. What followed was the greatest intelligence windfall since the Allies cracked Enigma. American and Japanese technicians had the Foxbat for 67 days. They measured it, photographed it, and disassembled it to the last bolt. What they found shattered years of assumption. The MiG-25's radar ran on vacuum tubes, not transistors, not microchips, brute Soviet engineering in place of sophistication. Its airframe was largely steel, not titanium. It had no look-down, shoot-down capability whatsoever. It could not engage low-flying targets at all. The weapon the F-15 had been built to fight was, in critical ways, far less capable than anyone had feared. But in another sense, it had done its job perfectly. The myth of the Foxbat had redirected billions in Western defense spending and shaped an entire generation of NATO strategy, without the aircraft ever having to live up to the threat. Japan returned the MiG to the Soviet Union in crates after the examination was complete. The Soviet government demanded Belenko back, but he refused. He was granted asylum in the United States, where he consulted for American military intelligence for years. The man who handed the West its most valuable Cold War secret had paid for it with everything: his country, his rank, his identity, and his family.